Hello, and welcome back to EECS 367, Introduction to Autonomous Robotics, and Robotics 320, Robot Operating Systems, at the University of Michigan for the winter 2022 semester. We are now at our 15th lecture of the semester, and we are officially in our last month of courses for this semester. So speaking for myself, this has gone by very, very quickly. And so in today's lecture, we're going to be talking about sampling-based approaches to motion planning. And in particular, we're going to be looking at probabilistic roadmaps and algorithms that will construct a roadmap data structure for planning based on a sampling procedure. And so before we get into the material for today's lecture, I will go ahead and minimize myself so that we can all see the slide content.
All right. So to start today, let's first go back and recall the set of topics that we've looked at within this broader area of motion planning. So you'll recall that throughout this semester, we've looked at a set of different algorithms that could be applied within our robot operating system for motion planning and for path planning. So recently we looked at, for example, a set of relatively simple reactive control algorithms, which were the bug algorithms, so bug 0, bug 1, bug 2, and tangent bug. Which were in contrast to the algorithms that we looked at earlier in the semester, which were deliberative planners based on graph search, especially the algorithm A star, which we of course implemented in Project 1. So we've looked at this set of algorithms up to this point, which leads us then to the final sort of two big topics that we're going to be talking about in the remainder of this course. So in today's lecture, we'll be discussing sampling-based search algorithms. And in particular, we'll look at probabilistic roadmaps and then rapidly exploring random trees, which will be implemented for our final assignment 6. Following that then, after today's lecture, we'll go into optimization-based approaches for search, which include gradient descent and potential fields. So for today, to start our discussion on probabilistic roadmaps, let's ask this question from the context of an autonomous car that would want to understand where it is within the world. So let's consider an autonomous car that's on some road, right? So it's on some, let's say, some interstate highway system, and it wants to understand where it is within the world. So really what the autonomous car is asking is, what is the current configuration at its current location? And so there's a number of different ways that the robot could represent this notion of a configuration, right? So one potential representation for configuration could be the latitude and longitude, right? So in this global frame of reference, you could give these two coordinate values to specify the exact position of the current robot's configuration. And so this latitude and longitude then would map to that global coordinate frame at some precise location. But of course, this is not the only representation for configuration that the robot could be using, right? So an alternative representation, which would be sort of just as valid, might be something based on, just as an example, this what three words representation, which represents every square meter of the Earth's surface with a unique set of three words. But the question that kind of comes up, whether we're using latitude and longitude or this what three words representation, or really any other specific representation, is how usable is that for robot configuration and for the specific tasks that our robot operating system is going to be using that configuration for. So if we think back and we kind of pick back on that latitude and longitude representation, one of the sort of challenges with this, and one of the important pieces of information that's lost if we were to just use latitude and longitude, is we lose the context of where within the global map of the world the robot is. And so the reason that that's so useful, right, in the context of an autonomous car, is that the local context, right, so the area surrounding the car, is very crucial for planning. It's very crucial for navigation and for safety. So in the context of this autonomous car, right, when we're talking about this notion of configuration, the actual map, like the actual road layout, is really what we're talking about. And it's really the information that the robot is going to need if it's going to be able to sort of efficiently and safely plan and and act within the world the way that a user would like it to act. And so sort of lucky for us, there's an existing map of the robot's environment and of the configuration space, which is given by the interstate highway system. So the actual interstate highway system is a very, very nice representation for configuration space of an autonomous car, because it includes all the possible locations that the car could exist sort of safely or in a valid state for the purposes of driving. And in addition to that, it still has the context, because you can relate different portions of the highway system to one another based on, for example, the path length between them, or based on the sort of local frames of reference at a given point within the system. And so this idea of road maps can be extended from geolocation, from actual road layouts, to robot configuration space, which would extend beyond just autonomous cars, but into mobile manipulator robots or quadcopters and various other robotic platforms. And so this data structure is what we're going to start off by talking about in the context of our probabilistic roadmap algorithm. So before defining roadmaps formally, let's first contrast these roadmap data structures to the graph data structure that we looked at earlier in the semester when we discussed A-star search and graph-based search algorithms. So the one very kind of key distinction between these two types of data structures is that the graph search assumed configuration space could be represented as a fixed uniform grid, where the graph would be represented then as a set of discrete cells that would be spaced uniformly throughout configuration space. And so the big difference then is that roadmaps don't have that requirement of being represented as a fixed uniform grid over configuration space. Instead, they can take on much sparser based graph forms. And so the advantage then is that when we try to scale our search to be beyond planar navigation, the pure graph-based data structures that are not roadmaps will suffer from the curse of dimensionality, because the number of vertices that's going to be required to represent those larger spaces is going to grow exponentially, whereas our roadmaps can remain much sparser in terms of the number of nodes needed to cover configuration space, and can therefore alleviate some of the challenge in those higher dimensional planning spaces, in configuration spaces. And so as a result of that, we can think of roadmaps as being a more general notion of graphs that are defined over configuration space of our robot. So let's define these roadmaps more formally. So for us, a roadmap is going to be defined as the union of curves such that all start and goal locations within configuration space, where start and goal locations can only exist within what we call Q-free, which is the portion of configuration space that's not going to be in collision with the environment. So it's the union of all curves such that these start and goal locations within configuration space can be connected by a path that exists within the roadmap. And so as a result, so you don't need to think about all start and goal locations necessarily as being vertices within the roadmap, but those start and goal locations need to be able to connect to the roadmap such that there could be a path between the two. So with this definition, we can then define three properties that can be applicable to a given roadmap. So for the accessibility of a roadmap is defined if there is a path from all Q start locations that exist within Q free to some point, some vertex within the roadmap, which we could call Q prime. A roadmap is said to be departable if there exists a path from some point within the roadmap, Q double prime, to all possible goal configurations within Q free. And finally, the connectivity is defined if there exists a path within a roadmap between all Q prime and Q double prime. So with this definition then, we could then create a fairly simple roadmap planner that will leverage this new data structure. And so this should be similar to our discussion of graph-based search. So the first step within this high-level roadmap planner would be to construct the data structure itself. So for our purposes, we can still represent the roadmap as a graph So we're going to have a collection of vertices or nodes and a collection of edges within this graph, where the nodes are going to be constrained to be only those that are valid within configuration space. So we say that a configuration Q is valid as long as it is not in collision with an obstacle within the world, and as long as it is within the joint limits, where those joint limits are applicable for our configuration space. And correspondingly then, an edge will connect two nodes within this graph if there is a free path within configuration space connecting the configuration Q1 and Q2 respectively. And so all configurations along the edge are then assumed to be valid, so not in collision with the world and within the joint limits. So given that we've constructed this roadmap as the first step, the following pseudocode could then be defined in steps 2 and 3 for our planner. So first we could connect the start and goal configurations given as input to our planner to the roadmap at some configuration nodes Q prime and Q double prime. And then finally we could find a path within the roadmap between Q prime and Q double prime. And that then would give us a full path between the start configuration and the goal configuration. So before we could actually implement that high-level notion of a roadmap planner, we need to understand how it is we could build the roadmap, right? So what algorithm is actually going to be used to construct the roadmap? And so there's two approaches that we'll talk about today. So broadly, the two approaches fall into these categories of deterministic algorithms and probabilistic algorithms. So we'll briefly talk about deterministic approaches that you could use to build a roadmap, and then the majority of this lecture is going to be focused on probabilistic sampling-based approaches. So the first deterministic approach that we could consider is what's called a visibility graph. So what we could imagine doing is we could take every vertex along the essentially polygon represented world obstacles, as well as the start and goal location, and we could trace lines that connect those vertices and treat those traced lines as our roadmap. And so the way then that you could potentially implement this as a deterministic algorithm is for every one of those vertices, including the start and the goal location, you could imagine essentially sampling basically like a discrete set of rays, and then evaluating where those rays intersect with other vertices that we want to consider. So in this figure, we're tracing the rays extending out of the start location, and then you can see the blue highlighted rays are those that intersect with vertices of our polygon world obstacles. And so then we would correspondingly add those rays to our visibility graph and then extend this sort of ray tracing process forward to consider all the other vertices along the polygon obstacles, resulting in a visibility graph shown here. At that point, then, we could convert that visibility graph into a roadmap by simply treating all the vertices along the polygon obstacles as nodes within the graph, and then the edges that we found from the ray tracing as edges within our roadmap. Another deterministic approach to creating these roadmaps is what's referred to as Voronoi planning. So Voronoi planning is based on this notion of a Voronoi diagram, which is what's illustrated on the right-hand side of this slide. So within this Voronoi diagram, what we are using it for is to represent essentially portions of the space that are equidistant to a specific obstacle. So each of the black points drawn within this diagram on the right-hand side would be representing an obstacle within the world. And so based on that obstacle, the Voronoi diagram then represents regions of the space that are essentially closest to that specific obstacle, such that then the boundaries between these regions of space could be used to form a roadmap. So to give a better intuition about how these Voronoi diagrams are created, let's look at an animation on the next slide, where the starting kind of frame for this animation starts with just the black points. And you can see that these sort of bubbles, these regions of space kind of expand until they fill up the entire space. So the n input points, which are these black circles, would be representing the position of obstacles within configuration space. And what the Voronoi diagram then is doing is it's finding these region boundaries such that each point along one of the boundaries is equidistant to two or more of the obstacles. And so using those boundaries then, we could treat the roadmap as the collection of the boundaries and plan as a trajectory that follows those boundaries. And so the advantage of this approach is that you'll ensure that the paths that your planner produces will always follow trajectories such that they're equidistant to obstacles. So it's essentially a way of trying to sort of maximize the distance that the robot stays away from obstacles. The cost that's then associated with this approach is that you're not going to necessarily ensure that you have the most efficient plan, because you're going to be always ensuring that you're avoiding obstacles, that you're staying like maximally away from the set of obstacles that are within the space. And so a shared characteristic of both visibility graphs and Voronoi diagrams is that they can be created using deterministic algorithms and then used for roadmap construction. In contrast, there's a second set of algorithms for creating roadmaps that attempts to be more efficient by considering portions of the space in a much sparser manner. And so these fall into the category of probabilistic algorithms that rely on sampling within the configuration space to create the underlying roadmap data structure. And so within this set of probabilistic roadmap construction algorithms, we're going to be talking about two particular algorithms, the first being probabilistic roadmaps and the second being rapidly exploring random trees, where for the final assignment that we have, so assignment 6, is going to be based on an implementation of rapidly exploring random trees within our Knievel environment. But before we get to RRT, let's first look at probabilistic roadmaps, which is going to be an algorithm that forms these roadmaps by sampling points within configuration space, connecting them where those sampled points are treated as vertices within a graph, and such that the resulting roadmap that's constructed could be used for multiple planning queries. So to begin, probabilistic roadmaps are going to be created using two phases. So first, the roadmap itself will be constructed, and once it's been constructed, you could then reuse the roadmap for multiple path queries. So in other words, you could plan multiple separate sort of routes within the constructed roadmap. And so to create this roadmap, we're going to be considering configuration space like we've been talking about. So the robot pose is going to take some point within this configuration space. And what we're going to want the roadmap to do is to cover valid poses within the configuration space that don't include invalid poses. So these would be poses that on the slide are indicated by the grayed out regions of the two-dimensional space, which is meant to convey obstacles or potentially joint limits within the configuration space. So to look at the construction phase more closely, the first step of probabilistic roadmaps is to sample n poses at random. So within the configuration space, you can see that we've plotted down these n randomly sampled points within the configuration space. At that point, the next step is to eliminate all of the invalid poses that we had sampled. So these would be poses that are outside of the joint limits or that are in collision with obstacles within the world. At that point, then, what will happen is we actually construct the graph data structure itself. So by connecting neighboring poses that we had sampled, we'll be able to construct our final roadmap. And so to define neighboring poses, the first step that we do is we take a nearest neighbor's threshold based on a local population around some given point within the sampled set that we had created in the first step of the algorithm. And at that point, then, we test whether using a local planner, whether the neighboring points are reachable without colliding with obstacles in the world or joint limits. And so as long as those neighboring points are reachable, we would then add an edge to our corresponding roadmap, connecting those two vertices that are the points we had sampled in the first step. At that point, then, we would have constructed a roadmap, which again is represented as this collection of nodes in a graph and edges within a graph. And at that point, then, we could use our probabilistic roadmap within the query phase, so we could actually perform route planning and motion planning using our data structure. So the query phase then is described as kind of summarized on this slide. So there's 4 steps within the pseudocode for this phase. So given that we have some constructed roadmap, and we also have a defined start and goal pose within configuration space, the query phase works as follows. So the first thing that we'll do is we'll attach each of the start configuration and the goal configuration to its nearest roadmap entry node. And at that point, we can then apply a known graph search algorithm to our roadmap to find a corresponding path through the roadmap that would lead from the starting entry node to the goal entry node. And at that point, we'll be able to return a path based on basically backtracking from the goal node to the start node through the graph, through the roadmap, that will be guaranteed to be a sequence of valid poses within configuration space and lead from start to goal. So a few considerations that are important to keep in mind for multi-query planning. So the first is that the number of samples that are needed to create our roadmap is going to be based on the dimensionality of configuration space. So as the dimensionality of configuration space grows, you'll need to increase the number of samples to cover the space well. The second important detail is to consider how your sampling is actually defined. So whether you use uniform sampling or non-uniform sampling in order to sample portions of the configuration space based on performance, desired performance characteristics. Next, there's an important notion of distance that you'll need to define in order to create your roadmap, and then also how you choose your local planner in conjunction with your definition of distance will decide how those local edges are actually constructed within the roadmap. Finally, one other important consideration for these multi-query planning algorithms is to consider how it is that you select neighbors within the roadmap construction, because this will have a big effect on the efficiency of the overall construction algorithm, whether you use, for example, k-nearest neighbors or a KD tree or some sort of hashing operation. These can have big impacts on the efficiency and also the resulting planning performance. So with that covers the probabilistic roadmap algorithm, which then leads into our discussion of rapidly exploring random trees. So rapidly exploring random trees, or RRT for short, is another example of a probabilistic roadmap construction algorithm, and it's going to be based somewhat on our discussion of the PRM algorithm that we've been talking about. So at a high level, what this algorithm is going to do is it's going to first sample and connect vertices within a tree data structure where the tree is rooted at the start or potentially the goal configuration. And based on that tree being constructed, then it will use the kind of final state of the tree as the roadmap for the purposes of planning. And so one really important distinction between RRT and the PRM algorithm, which we had looked at, is that RRT is what's known as a single query planning algorithm. And so it's not a multi-query planning algorithm, right? So in multi-query planning, what we did is we used probabilistic roadmaps to construct a roadmap, which we could then reuse for different start and goal configurations that would be given to us. And so the kind of key operating principle there was that our roadmap would still be constructed to kind of cover the configuration space independent of a given start and goal configuration. Whereas in single query planning, we're not going to try and reuse our roadmap across different planning inputs. So in single query planning like RRT, our algorithm will be given a start and goal configuration, and we'll use that knowledge to construct the roadmap for that specific start and goal. And so typically the way that these single query planning algorithms will work is they will grow trees that are rooted at the start and goal node towards each other, forming then a path once the trees connect. And so the focus of these algorithms is going to be to sample in unexplored areas of configuration space while still moving towards either the start or the goal node, respectively. And so two common algorithms from this class of single query planning would be expansive space trees and the algorithm then that we're going to be looking at, which is rapidly exploring random trees. So let's now look at the RRT algorithm. So we'll start by looking at pseudocode for the algorithm, and we'll step through some example animations to build intuition about how this pseudocode can be implemented and understood. So the RRT algorithm itself is going to be based on the construction of a tree data structure. So within the pseudocode that we have here, so you can see we have this build RRT function, which takes in an initial configuration. So this would be the starting configuration. And what this algorithm is going to do is it's going to build up a tree. So the tree in this case, you can see, is started at this start configuration. And for some preset number of iterations, the construction of the tree follows two steps. So first, we sample a uniformly random configuration from the configuration space. And next, we extend the tree based on this random configuration. And so this random sampling and random extension then is where the name rapidly exploring random trees comes from. So to understand this extend operation, let's first look and kind of recognize that the inputs to this extend are going to be the current state of the tree, right? So this current state within one of the iterations of k might look something like what's shown on this left-hand side of the figure. And the second input then is this qrand, which is just a random configuration that we've sampled from configuration space. And so in pseudocode, what the extend operation is going to do is shown then in this second algorithm here. And so essentially what we're going to do is we're going to find the nearest point within the tree that is nearest to this random configuration. And then we're going to decide whether or not to create a new configuration based on a epsilon length step in configuration from q near towards the q random. And so as long as an epsilon step along the straight line path between q near and q rand is valid, then we'll decide to create that new configuration q new and then add that to our tree. If the valid configuration if the q new would be invalid, then we would not add a new configuration to our tree, and instead we would return trapped. So let's take a look then in an animation to understand and kind of build some better intuition for how this extension is going to work across multiple steps. So in this case, let's say that in this figure, here is the tree that's given at the current state of our RRT algorithm running. So the existing RRT tree is going to be grown as follows. So first, we're going to randomly sample a new configuration from configuration space. So in this case, configuration space is over 2D. So we sample this random point in 2D space here. We're then going to identify which point in the current tree is nearest to this q random. And so based on our definition of distance, we'll identify q near to be here. So in this animation, we're using Euclidean distance, so just straight line distance. So we've now identified the nearest point in our tree, and then we'll then decide on a potential q new that is one epsilon step length along the straight line path from q near to q random. So this q new then will be considered for addition to the tree, where it'll be added to our tree if it's not in collision with the environment, which in this case it is not. So there's no obstacles overlapping with q new. So we'll then add it to our tree and then follow on to the next step of the RRT algorithm. So let's take a look then at my implementation for RRT and see what this looks like in practice. All right, so here we have our 2D path planning environment that should be familiar from Project 1. So this is where your implementation of RRT will first go, and then from the 2D environment, you can extend your RRT Connect implementation to the Knievel stencil. But for this animation, what I'll do is I'll restart the planner so we can see RRT commence. So I'll restart it right now. And so you can see that we start our tree from the starting node, and we're searching towards the green square, which is given in the lower right of the map here. So one by one, just as we saw in the animation from the previous slides, the RRT tree is being expanded at random locations using one vertex at each instant in time. And so until it samples a point right near the goal towards this very end, it's going to continue expanding. All right, so now we can see, so at the very end there, it was able to sample a point that led it to extend the tree within an epsilon step of the goal. And so you can see at that point then it was able to trace back the path all the way to the start node, which was then through this blue highlighted sequence here. And so one kind of important thought that you might be having is that we didn't use the information about where the goal node was in our definition of the RRT algorithm, right? So we instantiated our tree at the initial node, and then we just kept extending the tree with sort of disregard for the goal location, right? So there was no heuristic guiding us towards the goal. And there was no constraint on our extension of the tree that would make it prioritize moving towards the goal, right? We just continually would randomly propose configurations and then use those randomly proposed configurations for the extension. And so this motivates a thought then that we could potentially improve the efficiency of our algorithm if we used the knowledge about where the goal location was in configuration space to try and prioritize exploration towards that direction. And so this then motivates the creation of what's called the RRT Connect algorithm. And so this is the next algorithm that we'll be looking at, and it's the actual algorithm that will be required for assignment 6. So let's now look at the RRT Connect algorithm to understand how it's different from the RRT algorithm that we've been discussing. So on this particular slide, we have the pseudocode for RRT Connect, and in addition, we have an illustration which we'll use to step through the key procedures within RRT Connect. So at a high level, the key distinction between the base RRT algorithm that we had been talking about and the RRT Connect algorithm is that RRT Connect will maintain 2 independent trees during its planning procedure. So it will maintain one tree, which is rooted at QInit, which is the initial configuration for our planner, and it'll maintain a second tree that's rooted at QGoal, which is the goal configuration which we would like our planner to find a path towards. And so by maintaining these 2 independent trees, what RRT Connect can do is it can prioritize portions of the configuration space that will lead to paths from QInit to QGoal by constantly trying to connect the 2 trees together. So whereas the base RRT algorithm would maintain a single tree and explore the space randomly, RRT Connect can try and prioritize portions of the configuration space that will lead to paths from the start configuration to the goal configuration by connecting or attempting to connect the 2 independent trees. So let's step through now this pseudocode to understand what this algorithm is going to do. So the first line of the pseudocode here is just going to initialize these 2 independent trees. So you can see this tree T sub A is going to be rooted at QInit, whereas tree T sub B is going to be rooted at QGoal. At that point, then the algorithm will go through this iterative sub-procedure that we will step through. So for this step through, let's consider that the current state of the 2 trees are given in this illustration here, where tree T sub A, let's just say, is the tree that's rooted at the goal node, the goal configuration, so where my cursor is currently pointing, and tree T sub B is the tree that's rooted at Q init. So within this particular iteration that we're considering, the first thing we're going to do is sample a random configuration similar to how we would have done for base RRT. And let's just say that we sample a configuration roughly where my cursor is within the 2D configuration space. So what we'll then try and do is we'll try and extend the tree T sub A, which again is this tree here, in the direction of that random sample, so in the direction of my cursor, which in this case we can do since there's no collisions in that direction. So the extension procedure for RRT Connect is the same as we saw for RRT. So as long as that new configuration is valid, we can add a new vertex to our tree and then an edge from the nearest existing vertex in the tree to this new vertex, and then we'll return reached. So in this case, the extension was successful, so it returned reached, which was not equal to trap. So in this case, we're then going to try and connect tree T sub B to this new configuration Q new, which was just added. So at this portion of the search, the connect is going to be considering tree T sub B to be this second tree in our illustration. And so for the connect operation, the way it's going to work is it's going to repeatedly try to extend, using the same extension procedure, tree T sub B to this new configuration that was added to tree T sub A. So I'd recommend to probably pause the video and maybe even try writing out for yourself this particular kind of example that we've drawn out here, just to make sure that that you're following the distinction between which of these configurations belongs to which of the trees, because that is a key implementation detail that can be the source of many bugs for the RRT Connect algorithm. So if we go back to this connect where we were considering, so once again, so we're going to try and connect tree T sub B to this new configuration that was added to tree T sub A by repeatedly calling the extension subroutine on these two variables. And so in this case, because there are no collisions between this straight line path, you can see that this connect function is going to repeatedly add this sequence of new configurations to the tree T sub B until ultimately it actually reaches and makes a valid connection to the tree T sub A, resulting in a successful planning iteration. So at that point, our algorithm would know that there's a valid path between these two trees, which it could then return as its result, and then stop the search. In contrast, to have a little bit more of an interesting example, let's consider the case where there's a collision encountered during the connect operation. So if during the connect operation, the algorithm was able to maybe add 3 new configurations to the tree T sub B, which again is at this portion of the pseudocode here where my cursor is. If it then encounters a collision, it will stop this connect operation and move on to the next iteration of the algorithm. But one key detail is that before moving to the next iteration, it's going to swap the two trees in these variables T sub A and T sub B. And so conceptually, what we can think about that as doing is it's reversing the roles for these two trees so that at the next iteration, the tree that is attempted for expansion is the tree that had been attempted for connection in the current iteration. So in this particular case that we were looking at, the next iteration is going to try to extend this tree, which my cursor is highlighting, so the tree that was rooted at Q init. And so this is what ensures that the algorithm kind of fairly considers both of the trees during the extension and connection processes, respectively. So let's now look at an example animation of this RRT Connect process occurring. So once again, so we have our tree T sub A on the right-hand side and our tree T sub B to start with on the left-hand side. We're going to try to extend tree T sub A So we'll pick some random configuration and try and extend towards that. And that new configuration, since there's no collision in this case, becomes the target for our extension of the other tree. So the other tree now is going to try to extend along a straight line path in configuration space from the nearest point in its tree to this new configuration point in the tree T sub A. And so it's going to repeatedly extend until it is able to either connect to the tree, or if it had found a collision, it would have stopped and swapped the two trees before the next iteration. And so at this point, because it was able to connect the two trees, it would then return as its output this valid path through the roadmap, which connects the start configuration to the goal configuration. So let's now take a look at my implementation of RRT Connect to see how this operates within our 2D path planning example. So the thing to note is once I refresh the animation, the first thing you'll see is that both trees will be attempted to connect to one another by the RRT Connect algorithm. So I'll refresh the animation right now. As you can see right off the bat, right instantly, the two trees move in a straight line path towards each other until they reach the collision with the world object. And at that point, it then appears that both the algorithms move towards what would look like a traditional RRT. So let the animation play out here until the two trees are connected. And so there, at the very end there, one thing that was interesting to note is that it was at this expansion step here that then the connection occurred where the second tree, which was rooted of the goal configuration, was able to be connected in a straight line path to that newest extended node. But before then, because of the collisions with the world objects, the connection was not able to the connection subroutine wasn't essentially taking place. And so that's what led to that, what appeared to be that more base RRT behavior during part of the run there. But you can see that at the end, we did find a valid path that does not collide with the environment from the starting configuration to the goal configuration. And so this then concludes our RT Connect execution. So now that we have an understanding of RRT and RRT Connect, one important property of these algorithms that we should point out is that they are referred to as probabilistically complete, which means that in the limit, as you keep adding samples, the probability that they will find a solution if a valid solution exists approaches 1. So it is approaches a complete algorithm in probability. And so one kind of interesting way that we can think about this property is by first observing that the probability that a particular vertex is selected for extension within RRT is proportional to the area that corresponds to that vertex if you were to construct a Voronoi diagram based on the current tree within RRT. So on the figures here, what's being illustrated is a RRT Voronoi diagram in the second row for each of the trees in the first row. And so you can see essentially that as the trees are growing, the corresponding Voronoi diagram it essentially has additional subregions that are considered, and additionally that this RRT Voronoi diagram is approaching a uniform, like uniformly spaced and uniformly sized subregions within the 2D configuration space. And so this convergence to a uniform coverage of configuration space is a result of an increasing number of samples. So let's look at a few other examples of where RRT Connect has been applied. So still within a sort of path planning domain, this particular slide shows a few different types of robots where RRT Connect has been applied to. So in the top row, 2-degree of freedom maze, which is just like the 2D path planning example that we looked at and that you'll be implementing for assignment 6. Similarly, in the middle row is an example of RRT Connect applied to a 2-degree of freedom single passway map. Whereas the third row is slightly more interesting, where there's a 3rd degree of freedom added to the robot. So in that case, it's a theta, so it's a rotational degree of freedom. And in addition, the robotic structure itself takes on a form that has a sort of more interesting geometry than we've been looking at in our 2-degree of freedom maze. And so as a result, RRT Connect is still able to find a valid path, but it's able to do so by maneuvering the object's configuration as it traverses those pathways. Similarly, the piano movers problem would be an example of where RRT Connect could be applied. So to avoid collisions with the environment, RRT Connect could, as was applied in this particular example, essentially like move the piano through configuration space while avoiding collisions. And similarly, in the context of autonomous cars, which is where we started this lecture, you can add what are referred to as non-holonomic constraints to RRT Connect, so to ensure that the car-like motion is satisfied in the trees that are constructed. You could even add additional constraints like a right turn only car, and still ensure that valid trees are formed according to RRT Connect. And so this is desirable in the case of route planning for cars where you do have these types of constraints that you want to incorporate within your planner. The way that you would incorporate them in RRT Connect is during the tree expansion phase, where you decide whether or not a sampled node should be added or not. But in addition, there's also cases where, like this particular case, which is really pretty neat, I think, where there's kind of like geometric puzzles could even be solved using RRT Connect, because once again, you can represent the pose of the puzzle pieces as taking on points within a configuration space, and then correspondingly try and find a path through configuration space that would separate the poses. A few other examples from our Canvas stencil, which would be sort of good source material for maybe some of your debugging, just to give you a sense of what a valid RRT Connect solution would look like in terms of its behavior in these examples. So maybe the first case to always try is just an empty map where there's no collisions. So RRT Connect in this case should move just in a straight line path without any of that seeming randomness involved. But then in addition, if you move towards some of the other maps that we provide, so the MISC map, for example, you could expect behavior that might look something like this. Although I'll point out that in all of these examples, when there is randomness being used, you can't expect to have the exact same results as what we're showing here, but just this does give you a sense of what to expect. So here would be the narrow 1 map, some example from the narrow 2 map where the pathway is a little bit more intricate. And then another good one to test is the 3 sections map. And I would add that in the case of the Knievel stencil, so in the 3D world, we also have a set of varying maps provided. And I definitely recommend that you test your RRT Connect implementation in all of the maps that we provide, and even potentially creating your own maps in addition to the ones that we provide, just to make sure that your implementation can work in a broad array of environments. Because one thing that you'll find is that sometimes corner cases will come up that, depending on the particular map, that are hard to find otherwise. So now that we've looked at RRT and RRT Connect, one thing that we could maybe observe is that these algorithms are not using knowledge of the map and of the obstacles within the environment, right? So they're assuming that the algorithm doesn't have access to that information. It just knows the start configuration, the goal configuration, and then how to sample from the space and evaluate collisions locally. But this does motivate the question that, maybe we could make these algorithms faster, or maybe we could look at other algorithms that are faster if they had knowledge of the obstacles within the environment, so that they knew where to focus their search within the configuration space. So maybe there could be a simpler algorithm that would be able to focus its search within these portions of configuration space that we should be thinking about. And so that motivates the topic of the next lecture. So within the next lecture, we're going to be looking at the sub area of potential fields and how we can use potential fields within our motion planners. So we'll look at notions of cost map and descending cost map in order to find plans that that form what is known as a potential field. And so with that will conclude today's lecture. So I thank everybody for listening to today's lecture. I look forward to seeing everybody during lecture and lab sections this week. And so one thing that I will point out is just as a reminder that we have our assignment 5 is going to be due this Wednesday. And so just try and make sure that you're in a good state for that as that assignment comes due. We'll have a few additional office hours this week. So on Monday and Wednesday, I'll have my office hours. So be sure to answer or to come to those for any remaining questions. And also remember that we have the Slack channel available if you have pressing questions on those assignments as the due date approaches. But with that will conclude today's lecture. And once again, thanks for listening, and I look forward to seeing you this week.